So I wanted to start off by telling you why I originally got into this stuff. So who knows who this is? No one? There's like 2 people back there. Okay, this is Sydney Bristow. It was a character played by Jennifer Garner in the 2001 TV show Alias. The first 2 seasons of Alias were like some of the best television, and then J.J. Abrams got really distracted by making Lost, so it got really bad after that. But go back and watch the first 2 seasons. It's really, really good. So anyway, Sydney Bristow was a double agent for the CIA, and it was like she got to do cool spy stuff and like run around the world. Yeah, I'm gonna try not to swear. So she got to run around the world and like save the day doing like cool spy things and breaking codes and all this cool stuff. And so when I was registering for classes my freshman year of college, I signed up and saw this math seminar called Introduction to Cryptology, and I was like, cool, I'm gonna be the next Sydney Bristow, this is gonna be awesome. Little did I know Introduction to Cryptology was a bunch of number theory and math proofs. So that was not exactly what I expected, but the professors did entertain us a little bit with some of the code breaking type of stuff, but I ended up getting really good at math proofs and have since forgot most of that. So that was my first introduction to cryptography, and I wanted to share with you some of those foundations that I learned then. I'm sorry to report that we are not going to be talking about cryptocurrencies today. If that is why you're here, I'm very sorry. We are Team Crypto, stands for cryptography, for the next 40 minutes. So I also want to spend some time talking about the practical applications of this kind of stuff. I think cryptography is the underlying foundation for a lot of the things that we use online for authentication now. And so in all likelihood, most of you aren't going to go on to build super complicated cryptographic systems from scratch. That's totally fine. I think the goal of this presentation is to give you a fundamental understanding of what's happening under the hood of the tools that you're using every day. So in this talk, we're going to outline the origins of public key cryptography, where it came from and how it's evolved over the course of history, also what public key cryptography is and how it works, and where you're likely to find it in the real world. So my name is Kelley Robinson. Like was mentioned, I work at a company called Twilio. We are outside if you want to come stop by and learn more about what Twilio does. We are a communications company that provides APIs for sending and receiving text messages, making and receiving voice calls, and doing things like adding authentication into your applications. So how many of you are Authy users or have heard of Authy? A handful of you? Awesome. So Twilio actually acquired Authy about 4 years ago, and I have the privilege of working on a lot of the Authy APIs for doing things like adding 2-factor authentication and phone verification into your applications. And underneath the hood of those APIs is a lot of cryptography because they're doing security fundamentals. And so I wanted to learn more and have a better understanding of how all of this worked in authentication systems so that I could be more effective at my job. So the history of cryptology is usually told with our characters Alice and Bob in this illustration represented by Regina and Gretchen. So Alice and Bob are basically the characters in every single anecdote about what cryptography does. And so in the beginning, we had Alice and Bob, and they want to send secret messages to each other, but they don't want an eavesdropper to be able to see that message. And so the way that you can do this is by agreeing on some kind of shared secret key or token ahead of time. And that can be as simple as like a text shift. And so you could shift every letter in the alphabet by 3 letters. And then you could write messages that way. You could substitute letters for other letters, substitute letters for numbers. You can come up with creative ciphers and shifts and keys for doing this. But as long as both people know what that key is and how to decode and encode the message, you can pass secret notes to each other and figure out a way to have secret messages. But the problem that comes with this is that if the eavesdropper, the man in the middle, is able to figure out what your key is, they're able to intercept all of your messages and be able to decode them. This is known as symmetric key cryptography. You're using the same key on both ends of the equation. This worked really well for World War II spies and high school girls. But once we got into the age of the internet and we're no longer dealing with trusted entities, you start to encounter more situations where you want to really prevent eavesdroppers being able to intercept your messages. So we invented public key or asymmetric cryptography so that two people like Alice and Bob can communicate without having to first agree on that key in advance. Because one of the other problems with this is that you end up having to transmit the secret key. You have to tell somebody what the encryption method is. And if you don't trust the other entity and you can't like meet up with them in person first to do that, that becomes problematic because you don't have as good of a way to transmit that over an already unsecured channel. So public key cryptography is an incredibly necessary advancement, mostly because of the internet. We're no longer dealing with people that we know and trust, and we're no longer dealing with people that we have access to, that we can meet in the real world to figure out if we trust them to start with. So what is public key cryptography? So each entity is going to have two keys, and I say entity here specifically because it might not necessarily be a user. Just so you know, there's some seats over on this side too if anybody wants to come over here. So it's not just going to be necessarily users. One or both sides of this equation could be a computer. And so we're using the word entity here to describe it. The first key that somebody's going to have is a public key. And this is something that you can share widely. And the second key is going to be a private key. And that's what you want to keep secret. And that's what you want to make sure that you never share with anyone else. And this is how public key cryptography works. You generate the keys at the same time using a mathematical function. And we'll get more into what that looks like in a bit. And because the keys are mathematically linked, you can use the public key to encrypt the message and use a private key to decrypt the message. I'll give you a second on this slide. One small note, when I'm talking about this, asymmetric cryptography, public key cryptography, PKC, these are all like terms that I'm going to use interchangeably. Public key cryptography and asymmetric cryptography are generally the same thing and used pretty interchangeably. Additionally, the algorithm that I'm going to be using to reference the way that we generate keys is the RSA algorithm. There are other algorithms. I'm going to touch on a couple of other ones. But specific to the use case that I'm outlining in this illustration, we're specifically going to be talking about RSA. RSA was invented by three dudes whose names started with the letters R, S, and A. I don't know what their names are. You can look it up if you care. But that's how the algorithm was named. So there's two major use cases for doing public key crypto specifically with RSA. The first one is what we kind of already looked at, which is encrypting with a public key. And the second one is going to be signing or authenticating yourself with a private key. And so let's take a look at what both of those look like. If you want to be encrypting with a public key, this is the same graphic that we already saw. And so what you're going to do here is if Alice wants to send a message to Bob, she's going to have access to Bob's public key. And this is the key that Bob's able to share because he has sole control over his private key. And so Alice has Bob's public key, and she encrypts her message with Bob's public key. Because she doesn't want anybody else besides Bob to be able to read that message, she can send that to Bob. It doesn't matter if it gets intercepted because only Bob has the private key that can decrypt the message. The second use case for this is signing or authenticating with a key pair as well. And so in this case, Alice can send the same message to Bob, but her use case here would be validating that she was the one that sent the message. And so the way she does this is she signs the message with her private key. Instead of an encrypted or a ciphertext, the encrypted bit is then called the signature. And because Bob has access to her public key, she can tell him, hey, Bob, this is the message that I wanted you to have. And here's the signature of this message. Decrypt the signature with my public key. And if it matches the message that I'm telling you I sent you, you can be sure that I'm the one that sent you that message. So encrypting with a public key and signing with a private key, these are the two main use cases for public key cryptography, and you can combine these two together. And so you could have encrypting with Bob's public key and signing with Alice's private key on the same message and use that to both authenticate that it was coming from Alice and making sure that Bob's the only one that can read the message. So the short story and explanation for how keys are generated is math. We'll walk through exactly how this works with the RSA algorithm. But just know that when these keys are generated, they're generated at the same time, and there is a formula that links them together. So I want you to think about mixing together two paint colors. That is an operation that's really easy to do in one direction. It's really easy to take two paint colors and mix them together. Blue and yellow create green, but once you have green, it's really difficult to factor that back out into the original paint colors. Even if you know that that green came from blue and yellow, you don't know exactly which shades of blue and yellow that was, and it's really hard, if not impossible, for you to factor that out into its original pieces. And this is an idea that we see all the time in physical security. And so you can think of something like locks, tamper-proof screws, sealed packages. These are all things like the ink cartridges that they put on your clothing at clothing stores. These are all things that are really easy to put on or close or lock, but they're really hard to undo in the other direction unless you have some kind of key or way out of doing it. And so this becomes, it's technically possible to undo these things, but it's difficult enough that most people don't take the time or money to try, and that's why it keeps it secure. Cryptography uses the same principles to apply this to digital security. So we use calculations that are really easy to do in one direction and really hard to reverse unless you have a key. And we call these trapdoor one-way functions. Trapdoor functions are a subset of one-way functions. Hashing would be an example of a one-way function, but a trapdoor one-way function specifically has some kind of key that allows you to reverse it. And so it's not possible to reverse it or not easy to reverse it unless you have that key. And one way that we achieve this in digital security is by multiplying together two really large prime numbers. So one of the things that I learned in that number theory class is that it's surprisingly difficult to take a really large number and find its factors. It's not something that you can do or apply a formula to figure out what the factors of a number are, especially if there's only two. And if you multiply together two prime numbers, then there's only going to be two factors to that result. And so this is a way that we can have a trapdoor function for security. It's totally possible for you to undo it, but it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of computing power. So I want to think about which one of these is easier. If I tell you to go find the two prime factors of 4,757, how would you do this? There's probably, like, you could write a script to do this in Python, like loop through a bunch of known prime numbers, and eventually you would end up with the ones that you want because this is only a 4-digit number. You're going to get to a limit eventually. But think about if you had to do this with a number that is 100 or 1,000 digits long. It's going to be a lot harder, and even the most sophisticated computing systems take a long time to figure that kind of stuff out. And this is how we have this type of security in digital security and cryptography. But now if I tell you to go multiply together 71 and 67, you can do that pretty easily. Most computers can do that pretty easily. So this is the trapdoor function that we're using for security, and one of the ways that we are able to make this easy to lock in one direction and hard to decrypt in the other direction. I'm now going to walk through an example of how this works with RSA. We're using intentionally small numbers here, and I wrote up a script that does all of this, and I put it on my GitHub there. I'm going to tweet a link to these slides after, and I'll tweet all the links that I mentioned in this if you want to go check this out and play around with it. The script that I wrote is totally interactive, so you can try it with different inputs and different numbers. So you have three inputs for RSA. You have a P and a Q. Those are going to be your prime numbers that are inputs. Ours are 67 and 71. But in practice, if you were doing this for real in RSA, you would have prime numbers that are like 600 digits long. And then we have a public exponent that is 37 in our case. And then we're going to use those numbers to make some calculations. And so we multiply together P and Q. We take subtract one from each of those numbers and then multiply those together. And then we take the modular multiplicative inverse of our exponent and x. This is missing the function for inverse mod, but that's just about 15 lines of Python code, and I can reference that later. So the interesting thing about all of these calculations, if you look at these are all trapdoor functions. They're all one-way functions that are really hard to reverse in the other direction unless you have one of the keys in this case. Like if you had P or Q or both, it would be really easy to figure these out. And then once you have those calculations, you can generate your public and your private key. And in this case, so your public key and your private key are actually tuples of two of these calculations and the public exponent. And once you have those keys generated, then you can encrypt a message like 1, 2, 3 using your public key, and then decrypt your encrypted message using your private key, and that will return the original message. So it's pretty cool. Oh, I just got really aggressive with that. Okay, so other common algorithms that you're going to encounter, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these, but I do want to bring your awareness to them because these are some things that you might encounter. So Diffie-Hellman key exchange is one of the most fundamental, it was the introduction to public key cryptography. And so this is a really cool method that these two researchers came up with in order to generate a shared key together. And so the process for doing this is a little different than what we saw with RSA, because at the end of this, you have a shared secret key. And so what you would do is, if you illustrate this using our paint mixing example, Alice and Bob would both start out with a shared paint color, and then they would each pick their own private paint color. And they're not going to tell anybody else what that private paint color is. And then they're going to mix their private paint colors into the shared public paint color, and then they're going to swap their mixtures. And when they swap their mixtures, even if that gets intercepted, it's fine because it's hard for the person that intercepts it to factor that back out into its original pieces. And then once they have the other person's mixture, they can mix in their private secret paint color, and at the end, they end up with the same paint color. It's really, really neat, and it's a way that you can generate a shared secret if you don't have access to the other person, if you don't have a trusted way of communicating with the other entity that you're going to be dealing with. Of course, in practice, this is done using modular arithmetic and other prime number multiplication like we saw with RSA, but I think illustrating it with paint colors is a good way to show how the building a shared secret works. The next algorithm that I want to talk about is elliptic curve cryptography. And this is something that I think you're going to see a lot more of in the next few years, because this is something that's relatively new and still gaining a lot of traction. And one of the reasons that elliptic curve cryptography is going to gain traction is because it's actually more efficient. And I'll talk about why that is in a couple of slides. But the way that this works is that the one-way function here is going to be bounce around to different points on this elliptic curve. That's the function for an elliptic curve up at the top there. And you bounce around in some predictable way, some number of times, using tangents and intersections with the curve. And if you do that a predictable way in a certain number of times, you're going to end up with a point on the curve that is going to effectively be your secret key. And if you are just given that point on the curve, you have no way of backing that out into the original inputs that you need in order to be able to decrypt the message. And so this is another way that you can use one-way functions to encrypt and get secret keys. I mentioned that it's more efficient. The reason that it's not as widely used as something like Diffie-Hellman or RSA is mostly because it's newer and it's slightly harder to implement. Elliptic curves are not super intuitive, and so it's something that there aren't as many resources out there for doing this yet. There aren't as many libraries and Unix tools and that kind of stuff for implementing elliptic curve cryptography, and so I think it's going to take a couple of years for this to gain a lot more traction. Let's talk about why elliptic curve is more efficient, and that has to do with key size. And so in this example, the key size is going to affect the level of security that any algorithm has. So in this example from XKCD, the key size of the algorithm that they're mentioning is 4096 digits. And so it's a 4096-bit RSA encryption. The joke here is that a crypto nerd would be like, no, you can't break into my computer because I encrypted it incredibly securely. Of course, in practice, any kind of robber is just going to hit you over the head with a wrench and make you tell them the password. But in theory, if the robber was not in person and trying to do this over a network, they would have a hard time breaking into this because that is a really high level of encryption. So key size impacts security strength, and security strength is measured in bits of security. And so the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a governing body that does everything from recommending password requirements to things like cryptographic key size, their recommendation for the current current security strength is 112 bits of security. And so this is going to be okay for like the next 12 years. And so if you want to have 112 bits of security, you need an RSA key size of at least 2048. But key size in different algorithms produces different levels of security and different bits of security. And so you can see that a RSA key size of 3072 bits is equivalent in security strength as an elliptic curve key size of 256 bits. And so this is how elliptic curve is more efficient, is because you can have a smaller key size and get the same level of security. And if you're doing a lot of transactions very, very frequently, the smaller key size is going to be more efficient for your calculations, and it's going to get you a faster result. I do also want to mention elliptic curves is what Bitcoin uses, and so there's been a lot of hotness around that lately, and so people are starting to learn more about how elliptic curves work. NIST's conservative estimate is that by 2030, if you want your public keys and your keys to be valid past 2030, is that you should start using at least 128 bits of security. And so that's a conservative estimate based on basically advancements in computing power, hardware, possible discoveries of new algorithms and more efficient ways to break these types of things. But their conservative estimate is that you're good with 2048 bits of RSA until about 2030. And security strength itself is basically just a measure of how much force you would need in order to break into or crack that encryption algorithm. And so they use that and that's why it's different based on the algorithm that you use, because different algorithms have different methods for cracking them. You can either brute force it, you can try to cover the entire key space. There's a few different ways that you can do that, but security strength is a way to measure how possible it is based on the key size. So let's take a look at one of the libraries that implements public key cryptography in Python. I'm looking specifically at the cryptography library. This would be pip install cryptography. There are other libraries that do this. One of the reasons that I like the cryptography library is because it separates its APIs into things that are safe, things that you probably can't mess up if you try to use those, and things that are hazardous that you should be very careful if you try to implement. And so its primitives for working with public key cryptography are under the hazmat section, which means that you should probably be very careful if you're using this. And so this is how you would generate a private key using the cryptography library. They make sure to warn you that here be dragons and dinosaurs with laser guns if you're trying to implement this yourself. So only implement this if you're sure you know what you're doing. Once you have the private key, you can use the public key to encrypt a message, and then you can decrypt the ciphertext with your private key to get your plain text, and your message will be equivalent to your plain text decryption. Similarly, you can use this library to sign a message, create a signature using the private key, and then we can verify that that message is equal to the signature. And in very Python form, if it doesn't match, it will just throw an exception. So let's talk about some everyday uses of public key cryptography. TLS or encryption. So if you're doing anything over HTTPS, this is how it's safe to send credit card information over the internet. Bitcoin, like I mentioned, messaging platforms like PGP and GPG, and my personal favorite, Authy, uses public key cryptography to do this in one of our methods of two-factor authentication. And so let's look at how that works. This is push authentication, and so this is a form of 2FA where you can log into a website, get a notification, and either approve or deny that as your second form. And so we have an API for doing this in the Authy application, and this uses public key cryptography. So when you add a new website or enable push authentication in Authy, the public key gets stored on Authy's servers. You generate the key pair on your device, though. And so then you send the public key to Authy's servers. The private key never leaves your device. And then when you make the request to either approve or deny the message, you are signing that request with your private key that then Authy can validate came from your device. And so that's one way of doing authentication with public key cryptography. And this is also why this is one of the most secure forms of doing two-factor authentication. If anyone was in the last talk that was talking about OTPs and using PyOTP, that's a form of symmetric key cryptography. And so you have the same key that gets stored on your device in the servers, and that's using the same key to decode and encode that. And that key gets shared when you scan that QR code to put a new application on your authenticator device. Another example of public key cryptography is generating SSH keys. So who here has added an SSH key to their GitHub account? So you've all encountered this page, and this is using public key cryptography to do that. And so they point you at this SSH keygen Linux command, and so this is available on Mac OS and Linux. It's also available in Git Bash for Windows. And so there's some interesting things that you do here. And so you're telling it what type of algorithm to use, and they use RSA. And then you're also telling it what key size to use. And so GitHub wants to be very secure. They don't need this to be 4096 bits, but they want it to be very secure. And so you're creating a very large key size. And then every time that you upload or push code to GitHub, you are signing that code, and that's how GitHub authenticates that it came from your device. Very quickly, if you're using Keybase, this is a form of doing public key cryptography for GPG. I have my public key. This is a thing that I put on my website that validates that my website was available, or my website belongs to me. And then it has an object that I'm going to sign, produces a signature, and then because anybody that has that public key can decrypt the signature and validate that it was mine, this is how Keybase is able to validate that I was the one that owns my website. So the best applications of these concepts are when the end user doesn't have to think about how to do it. PGP gets mocked a lot because nobody knows really how to do it, and I think that's what XKCD is getting at in this comic. Like, sure, if it says begin PGP signed message, it's probably secure, probably came from the person that signed it. But I don't know, has anybody ever actually decrypted a signature? I haven't, and this is kind of what I do for a living. So I think it's something that we need to take into account as we're building applications to make sure that it's done in a way that makes it easy for the end user to use. GitHub is a good example of this because, yeah, you have to go through some steps to actually run that command, but you do it once for every new device that you add, and then you don't have to think about it again. Don't roll your own crypto. SignBuddy says don't do that. This basically just means that don't try to write your own RSA algorithm. Use well-encrypted or well-accepted encryption schemes that already implement this for you. There are libraries out there that will do this for you if you need to add cryptography into your applications. Just a couple of notes. This is a lot of information. I also wrote a blog post about this if you want to go reference this. So this is on the Twilio blog. I'll tweet out the link to this after my talk. And then this is just for fun, but there's this really great podcast called Astonishing Legends, and they did this really good story about the Tamam Shud Somerton Man mystery case. Has anybody heard of this? Oh my gosh, it's a fascinating use of an hour of your time listening to a podcast. So basically in 1940s Australia, there was this guy that was found dead on a beach, and this story has everything. It has unsolved murders, it has illicit affairs, it has Russian spy theories, but one of the coolest things about it is that there was a piece of paper found in the guy's pocket with some kind of encrypted text on it, and to this day, nobody's been able to decrypt it. So now that you're all cryptography experts, maybe that could be you. Come find me after this if you have any questions. I'm going to be hanging around the Twilio booth for most of the rest of the conference. Once again, my name is Kelley Robinson, and thank you for listening.